Welcome back to English BookCast. I hope you're ready for another deep dive.
You know it.
If you're enjoying these explorations,
Into these fascinating realms.
yes, please hit that subscribe button
That's right.
and share the channel. Help us spread the word.
Absolutely. Get more curious minds involved.
Exactly.
We love having more people.
So, for anyone just tuning in, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we kind of take a big stack of, well, whatever it is, sources, articles, research, you name it.
The intellectual heavy lifting, you could say.
Exactly. And we kind of distill it down.
To those juicy nuggets of knowledge, insights you can actually use.
That's it. And today, we're stepping into some pretty uncharted territory. We're going to question, the very foundation of how we understand history, how we understand the past.
Buckle up. This is a wild ride.
We're talking about the work of Anatoly Fomenko
Oh, yeah, he's something else.
and his book, History, Fiction, or Science. Big question right off the bat. How do we even categorize this? Is it history in the traditional sense?
As we typically think of it, I'm not so sure.
Or is it more like, I don't know, closer to fiction because of how he reinterprets things so radically?
It's radical, that's for sure.
Or is there a scientific method at play here? Something rigorous?
Something that forces us to look at it differently.
Right.
It's a good question.
So to guide us through this maze,
This intellectual labyrinth.
yeah, we'll be primarily focusing on
Fomenko's core arguments, his strategies,
Yeah.
how he tries to prove his points.
as laid out in the first two volumes of History, Fiction or Science,
That's the foundation.
and then also his book, Mysteries of Egyptian Zodiacs and Other Riddles of Ancient History.
Those are the key texts, I think, for understanding where he's coming from.
Now, gotta say, Anatoly Fomenko is not your typical history buff, is he? I mean, the guy is a renowned mathematician,
A top-tier mind.
a specialist in some really complex areas like Hamiltonian dynamical systems.
Oh, yeah, that's way over my head, to be honest.
Yeah, me too. But essentially, it's about the math of movement, how systems change over time,
The underlying patterns.
that kind of thing. He's a leader in that field. And then you've got his work in topological classification of integrable Hamiltonian systems
I'm just going to nod along to that one.
and Plateau's problem in spectral minimal surface theory.
Okay, you lost me again.
But the point is, he's seriously brilliant. In fact, he won the Russian Federation National Prize in Mathematics in 1996.
That's a big deal.
So we're dealing with a sharp, analytical mind, but one that approaches history from a completely different angle.
A total unique perspective.
And it's important to mention his collaboration with G.V. Mussorgsky, especially on their book, History of the New Chronology.
That's where a lot of their shared ideas are fleshed out.
Right. And what's interesting? In his works, Fomenko actually thanks a bunch of professors and candidates of physical and mathematical sciences for their support.
Oh, really?
Yeah, which suggests that even though his theories might be seen as out there, they've at least sparked some serious discussion within scientific circles.
Makes you wonder, doesn't it?
So here we are. We've got a world-class mathematician, a view of history that's revolutionary, maybe even heretical to some, and a collection of some pretty dense material to work through.
A real intellectual feast.
All right, so what's the mission here? What do we want you, the listener, to get out of this deep dive?
Well, our main aim is to grasp Fomenko's fundamental approach to the historical timeline, how he sees it all unfolding.
And we'll really dig into his central claims and, most importantly, the methods he uses to back them up.
We gotta see if the evidence holds up, Brad.
Okay, so let's get to the heart of it. What is it about Fomenko's argument that's caused such a stir? Why is everyone so worked up?
Well, at the core of it all is his new chronology. It's a theory that basically throws down the gauntlet to the accepted timeline of ancient and medieval history.
The one most historians use,
The
right?
one we all learned in school, yeah.
Okay.
It's known as the Scaligerian chronology, named after Julius Caesar Scaliger and Denis Batavius. They were the guys who really shaped it back in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Okay, so Fomenko's saying this widely accepted timeline is wrong, fundamentally flawed.
Yes, full of errors, in desperate need of an overhaul. And here's where his background comes in. He insists that his conclusions aren't based on intuition or interpretations of myths or legends or something.
Not just gut feelings.
No. He says it's based on empirical statistical methods, hard data applied to the historical record. Chronicles, manuscripts, archival documents.
Empirical statistical methods
Yeah.
applied to history.
Huh.
That's like, I don't know, using physics to analyze a painting.
Exactly. It's a very different approach. And that's where things get both really interesting and really controversial.
So how does a mathematician go about statistically dissecting historical texts? What does that even look like?
Well, that's where Fomenko and his team get innovative. Some might even say radical. They've developed a whole set of new techniques, all empirical and statistical, specifically for analyzing historical writings.
So they're not just reading these texts for the stories they tell.
No, no, no. They're looking for quantifiable patterns, measurable things.
Like what? Give us an example.
Okay, so they have this idea of similar images. These are patterns that keep popping up in different texts, even if the texts are supposedly describing completely different historical periods or cultures.
Like geckos across time.
Exactly. And they also search for what they call homologous fragments.
Homologous, like in biology.
Kind of, yeah. Basically, these are sections of text that seem to share a common origin, or maybe they describe the same underlying events, even though they appear in totally different contexts.
So they're suggesting these texts are related, even if history tells us they're not.
Right. It's like looking at the DNA of historical documents, trying to find those shared genetic markers that connect them.
That's a powerful analogy. So what are they actually counting or measuring? What are these similar images or homologous fragments in concrete terms?
Well, they use a bunch of different methods. One is creating volume graphics of the chapters within a historical chronicle.
Like a visual representation of how much text is devoted to different periods.
Exactly. Imagine plotting a graph where time is on the x-axis and the amount of text for that time period is on the x-axis. They analyze the shape and patterns of those curves.
Interesting.
They also meticulously count the number of unique names mentioned in different parts of a text.
Why is that important?
Well, it gives them a sense of the density of the narrative, the number of individuals involved.
Okay, so what else do they look at?
They track how often certain years are mentioned, the frequency.
So if a year is mentioned a lot, it might indicate something significant happened.
Exactly. They're looking for patterns, for spikes in the data that might reveal something important, and they also analyze the way different texts reference each other.
The citations, basically.
Right. The idea is that by looking at all these measurable factors, these hidden connections, dependencies, even duplications might emerge. Stuff you wouldn't notice just by reading the text casually.
So they're looking for the fingerprints, the traces that connect these historical accounts.
Exactly. Now, you mentioned something earlier called the frequency damping principle. I gotta admit, that sounds more like physics than history.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So how does that concept apply to old books and chronicles?
Well, it's actually borrowed from the way we analyze oscillations and signals in physics and engineering. Think about a sound wave. A smooth, consistent tone versus a really chaotic, noisy signal.
Okay, I'm following.
Now, in terms of historical chronicles, this principle suggests that if the chapters of a chronicle are laid out in the correct chronological order, then the graphs of those textual characteristics we just talked about, the volume, the frequency of years, all that those graphs should have a certain smoothness to them.
Like a well-tuned instrument.
Precisely, a clear, harmonious tone. And if there are sudden erratic jumps or drops in the data, that might indicate that the order of events as it's presented in the chronicle is off.
That sections have been misplaced or maybe events have been mixed up?
Exactly. This damping of those chaotic fluctuations is what they look for as a sign of a consistent and potentially accurate chronological sequence within the text.
Okay, that's pretty clever. It's like they're listening for the rhythm of history.
A nice way to put it.
So how do they use this approach to compare different historical accounts? You talked about something called correlation of chronicles.
Right. So they analyze those volume curves we talked about, those plots of how much text is devoted to different time periods for different chronicles. And they make a key distinction between what they call poor chronicles and rich chronicles.
What's the difference?
A poor chronicle has lots of gaps, lots of years where there's little or no information recorded.
Like a sparse record.
Exactly. And a rich chronicle has a lot more detail, more information for most of the years it covers.
Got it. So how does this help them compare chronicles?
Okay, so here's the idea. If two or more chronicles are actually describing the same historical events, even if they were written from different perspectives, different languages, different details, their volume graphs should show correlated peaks.
Correlated peaks, meaning what?
Meaning if one chronicle has a period where the author wrote a lot about it because it was a big deal, a major event.
A peak in the volume.
Right. Then other chronicles describing the same event should also have peaks in their volume graphs around the same time, even if the details are different.
I'm starting to see how this works. So it's like they're comparing the excitement levels of different historical witnesses.
A good way to think about it.
If they all get worked up about the same events, then their accounts should show similar spikes.
Makes sense.
Okay, now what about this idea of dynastic parallels and duplicates? How do they find those statistically?
This one gets a little more complex, but it's fascinating. They apply mathematical perturbations to lists of rulers in different dynasties.
Perturbations, meaning they mess with the order.
In a way, yes. They systematically shift them, reorder them, even merge lists from different regions or time periods.
Okay, I'm listening.
And for each of these manipulations, they calculate a correlation coefficient. They call it CAB.
Okay, and what does that tell them?
It tells them how statistically similar or dependent two dynastic chronicles are. And they do this on a massive scale.
How massive?
They estimate they've compared something like 150 trillion virtual dynastic pairings.
That's a ridiculous number. Why so many?
Because they want to be thorough. They're looking for pairs of chronicles that show really strong correlations. And when they find them, they argue that these seemingly distinct dynasties might actually be the same lineage, just described in different ways.
Like historical echoes, but on a grander scale.
Exactly. They call them phantom dynastic duplicates.
So they're not just looking at whether the names sound similar. They're statistically analyzing the patterns of succession, the lengths of reigns, to find these echoes.
Right. It's about finding the hidden mathematical connections that traditional history might be missing.
Okay, now I know they apply this same approach to the Bible, and that's bound to raise some eyebrows.
Oh, yeah. This is where things get really interesting.
So how does their analysis extend to biblical narratives? What do they find?
Well, their view of the Old Testament is pretty unconventional. They don't see it as a continuous, linear historical account.
Like one long story.
No. They argue it's more like a collection of recurring fragments, like pieces of a puzzle that have been rearranged and placed in different books.
Like a tapestry woven from repeated threads.
That's a great way to put it. They've even labeled these fragments with letters like T, K, N, P, R, and say.
And how do they support this idea?
With statistics, of course. They analyze parallel passages, similar stories, recurring themes. They divide the text into 218 generation chapters and then look for statistical links between them. How often certain words or names appear or certain narrative elements.
Looking for the fingerprints of those repeated fragments.
Exactly. And their conclusion is that the historical part of the Old Testament is more like a mosaic of similar stories and themes.
And that this mosaic might have been assembled in a way that doesn't reflect a straightforward chronology.
Exactly. It challenges our typical understanding of the Bible as a simple, linear historical narrative.
This is all so fascinating, but
Yeah.
also so mind-bending. Now let's shift gears to another area where Fomenko takes a different approach. Astronomical correlations. How does he use events in the sky to question established dates?
All right, this is where things get really cosmic. So he meticulously examines historical records that mention things like eclipses, comets, supernovae.
Those big dramatic events in the sky.
Yeah. And then he uses astronomical algorithms to independently calculate the dates of those events.
Like using the laws of physics to verify the historical record.
Exactly. And then he compares his results to the dates given in the traditional Scaligerian chronology. And if there are discrepancies, if the dates don't match up, that throws the whole timeline into question.
Okay, so give us an example. What are some of these celestial events that Fomenko believes have been misdating?
One really significant example is a solar eclipse that happened on February 16th, 1086 AD. We know for sure, based on astronomical calculations, that the path of totality passed over Italy and Byzantium.
Big historical centers.
Right. And what's interesting is that Fomenko links this eclipse to an old church tradition that dates the crucifixion of Jesus Christ to the 11th century AD.
That's way later than what most people believe.
Much later. He also talks about a triad of eclipses in the 11th century, one in 1039, another in 1140, suggesting a period of intense celestial activity.
So he's using these eclipses as markers, as anchor points in his revised timeline.
Precisely. And what about those supernovae, those exploding stars? He's got something to say about those too.
Right. How do they factor into his theory?
Well, he identifies several supernovae between the 10th and 13th centuries AD that were documented in various imperial records.
So we know they happen.
For sure. There's the famous one in 1054, which is what created the Crab Nebula, and there are others in 1006, 1184, and 1230. He suggests these events might actually line up with certain historical events, but with a chronological shift of about 1053 years.
Another big adjustment to the timeline.
Right, and he also cites an earlier Russian scientist, N.A. Morozov, who claimed that astronomers back in the 17th to 19th centuries sometimes fudged their calculations.
To make them fit the Scaligerian chronology.
Exactly. They were so convinced that the traditional timeline was correct that they twisted the data to fit the narrative.
So it's like sometimes wanting to make the pieces fit can distort the puzzle itself.
A great analogy. It raises questions about how objective we can really be about the past.
Now let's talk about radiocarbon dating. It seems like a pretty objective way to date things, right?
It does, doesn't it? But Fomenko has some serious questions about its reliability, especially for really old stuff.
He doesn't just reject it outright.
No, he's more nuanced than that. He acknowledges that there is a 700 and 117-year dendrochronological scale that's a timeline based on tree rings.
Okay, so that seems pretty reliable.
Except Fomenko points out that this particular scale is based on North American bristlecone pines.
And what's the issue with that?
Well, it's not clear how well that scale applies to European and Asian dendrochronology. You can't just assume it matches up perfectly.
So there might be regional variations.
Exactly. Plus, he brings up some human-caused factors that could mess with radiocarbon levels.
Oh yeah, like what?
Well, there's the fact that nuclear weapons testing in the mid-20th century really messed with the concentration of carbon-14 in the atmosphere.
That makes sense.
And then there's the Suez effect. That's the decrease in carbon-14 due to us burning so much fossil fuel.
Which also messes with the dating process.
Exactly. And then, get this, he even points out that there's an inconsistency in how the half-life of carbon-14 is reported in scientific literature.
Like different numbers being used.
Yeah. Some say it's 5,570 years, others say it's 5,730. That's a difference of 160 years.
And that could make a big difference when you're dating really old things.
You bet. And what about techniques like wiggle matching? You know, where they try to match the variations in a sample's radiocarbon curve with the known fluctuations in tree ring data?
Right, trying to get a more precise date.
Yeah, well, Fomenko argues that this process can be pretty subjective. There's room for bias and interpretation, which could lead to inaccurate results.
So it's not as foolproof as it seems.
No dating method is perfect, especially when you're dealing with the distant past.
So Fomenko's not saying radiocarbon dating is useless, but he's pointing out its limitations.
Especially when you're dealing with ancient history.
Okay, now, for what might be the most mind-blowing part of Fomenko's work, those historical overlaps. This is where he starts connecting seemingly distinct periods and figures.
This is where the fun begins.
So what are some of these overlaps he proposes?
Well, he's got a whole bunch of examples. One is the Russian Tsar Khans, who ruled from 1276 to 1600 AD. He claims that they actually overlap with the rulers of the Habsburg Empire.
The Habsburgs. But they were in a different part of the world.
Exactly. But according to traditional history, their reigns line up almost perfectly.
But he's suggesting that they might actually be the same set of rulers, just seen through different historical lenses.
Right. It's like their story is being told twice in two different places.
And then there's that 1,000-year overlap he proposes between the ancient Roman Empire and the later ancient Roman Empire.
The one that fell in the 5th century AD.
Right. So he's basically saying that those are the same empire, just shifted in time.
Exactly. And he compares the lengths of reigns, the historical events, to show the parallels.
It's a radical idea, to say the least.
And it doesn't stop there. He even suggests that the Trojan War, you know, the one from Greek mythology.
Yeah, the one with Achilles and Hector and all that.
Right. He thinks that might actually be connected to the Gothic Wars of the 6th century AD.
The Gothic Wars. That's over 1,000 years later.
I know, it's wild. He also points to similarities between the word Trojan and other words that pop up in the context of the Gothic Wars, like the root TRN, TRQN.
So he's looking for linguistic clues as well.
Absolutely. He also suggests that Belisarius, a famous general from the Gothic Wars, might be a historical echo of Valerius, a figure from Livy's account of early Rome.
So these figures from completely different eras are potentially the same person.
That's what he's arguing. It's like history is a hall of mirrors, reflecting the same events and characters across different time periods.
This is seriously mind-bending, and he finds these overlaps in other places too, right?
Oh, yeah. For example, he mentions the Sanamura clan from medieval Europe, and he suggests that there might be medieval traces of Homer.
As in Homer the poet, the guy who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey.
The one and only. Fomenko thinks he might have lived much later than we think.
Like closer to the medieval period.
Exactly. He even proposes that the Peloponnesian War, the one between Athens and Sparta...
Oh yeah, from ancient Greece.
Right. He thinks that might have overlaps with events from the 14th century AD.
So he's compressing history, bringing these seemingly distant events closer together.
It's a radical reimagining of the timeline.
And the really wild part is, he doesn't just do this with historical events, he does it with people, too.
Oh, yeah. He connects specific individuals across huge stretches of time.
Like who?
Well, for example, he suggests that the ancient philosopher Plato,
Plato, the one who wrote the Republic.
that's the one. He thinks he might actually be Themistocleton, a Byzantine scholar from the 15th century.
So Plato, the cornerstone of Western philosophy, is potentially a medieval figure.
That's what Fomenko is proposing.
Wow. And he does this with other figures too, right?
Oh, yeah. He even suggests that the founder of the Ottoman Empire might be the same person as Amyntas the Fixed, a king from ancient Macedonia.
Okay, this is getting seriously weird.
But that's what makes it so interesting, right? It forces us to re-examine everything we thought we knew about the past.
It's like those optical illusions where you can see two different images in the same picture.
A great way to put it. Fomenko is saying history is full of these kinds of illusions.
And we've already touched on how he applies this approach to biblical figures, right?
Yeah.
Like the stories of Saul, David, and Solomon potentially being linked to Roman figures.
Exactly. And he doesn't stop there. He suggests that stories like the Garden of Eden, Noah's Ark, and the Exodus might have happened much later and in different places than traditionally believed.
Like, for example, he puts Eden somewhere near Rome.
Right, possibly inspired by the volcanic activity of Mount Vesuvius. And he suggests that the end of the kingdom of Judah and the Babylonian captivity might not have happened as long ago as we think.
So he's basically saying that a lot of our ancient history might not be so ancient after all.
Exactly. He thinks it's been pushed back in time, maybe for political or religious reasons.
It's a pretty radical idea.
But one that's worth considering, don't you think?
Absolutely. Now, we haven't talked much about his work on Egyptian zodiacs yet.
Oh, yeah, those are fascinating.
So how do those ancient star charts tie into his theory of a revised chronology?
Well, in Mysteries of Egyptian Zodiacs, he and his team analyze a bunch of these zodiacs that are found on temple ceilings and other artifacts.
Like ancient astronomical maps.
Exactly. And their goal is to figure out what those maps are telling us and to try and date them based on the positions of the stars and planets.
So they're using astronomy to verify the traditional dating of these artifacts.
Exactly. And what they find is that, according to their calculations, a lot of these zodiacs point to much later dates than what conventional Egyptology says.
So the stars themselves are suggesting a different timeline for Egyptian history.
That's what they're claiming. And these dates align more closely with Fomenko's new chronology, which puts ancient Egypt much closer to our own time.
It's like the ancient Egyptians are sending us a message through time.
Maybe they are. It's certainly a thought-provoking idea.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about Fomenko's core arguments, his statistical methods, his skepticism of radiocarbon dating, and those mind-bending historical overlaps he proposes.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. So going back to our initial question, how should we categorize Anatoly Fomenko's work? Is it history, fiction, or science?
That's the million-dollar question. It's not an easy one to answer.
He uses what he claims are objective scientific methods.
Statistical analysis, astronomical data, all that.
But his conclusions are so radical.
They challenge almost everything we thought we knew about the past.
And most historians and archaeologists reject his theories.
They say he's cherry-picking data, misinterpreting evidence, and ignoring established facts.
So it's a real battle of ideas.
A clash of worldviews, you could say.
And where does that leave us, the listeners?
Well, that's the beauty of it. We get to decide for ourselves.
We get to weigh the evidence, think critically, and come to our own conclusions.
Exactly. And that's what the deep dive is all about. It's about exploring ideas, even controversial ones, and encouraging people to think for themselves.
Now, as always, we want to end by addressing some of the fantastic questions we've received from you, our listeners.
So many great questions this time.
Let's dive right in. Our first question comes from @chronoskeptic. They ask, Fomenko relies heavily on statistical correlations. How do we know that these correlations aren't just coincidental patterns arising from the vastness of historical data?
That's a really sharp question at Chronoskeptic. It gets right to the heart of the issue with statistical analysis.
It's easy to find patterns if you look hard enough, right?
Exactly. And that's one of the criticisms leveled at Fomenko. How do we know these correlations are meaningful and not just random noise?
So how does Fomenko and his team address this?
Well, they argue that the correlations they find aren't isolated incidents. They say these patterns repeat across different sources, different types of data, different time
So
periods.
it's not just one or two coincidences, but a consistent pattern.
Right. And they use statistical tests to show that the likelihood of these correlations happening purely by chance is really, really low.
But of course, critics point out that correlation doesn't equal causation.
Exactly. Just because two things are statistically related doesn't mean one caused the other or that they have a shared origin.
So it's still open to debate how strong Fomenko's statistical evidence really is.
I think that's fair to say. It's an ongoing discussion.
Okay, next question comes from @AncientMysteryFan. They ask, if Fomenko's timeline is correct, what are some of the major historical events that are actually much more recent than we think?
Oh, this is a fun one to think about.
It really is. So, according to Fomenko's new chronology, a huge chunk of what we consider ancient history would be significantly compressed and shifted towards the medieval period,
We're talking about major civilizations like Egypt, Greece, Rome,
all happening much later than we're taught.
and events like the Trojan War, which is traditionally placed in the Bronze Age, might have happened as late as the 6th or even the 13th century AD.
And the Roman Empire, as we know it, would be much more recent.
The implications are massive. It would mean rewriting history on a grand scale.
All right, next question is from @DatumDiver. They ask, Fomenko is a mathematician, not a historian. Does his lack of formal training in history undermine his conclusions?
That's a common criticism, and it's a fair point. Historians are trained to look at sources critically, to understand the context, the biases, the nuances of language.
Things that a purely mathematical approach might miss.
Right. They argue that Fomenko is imposing his mathematical lens onto history and that he's missing important details,
But Fomenko would probably argue that the statistical patterns he finds are universal.
that they transcend individual contexts.
So if it's fundamental difference in how they approach history.
It's like two different languages almost.
And our last question comes from @TimeTravelerTheory. They ask, has Fomenko's new chronology gained any significant traction or acceptance within mainstream academic circles?
And the short answer is no. Most historians and archaeologists reject his theories.
They say his methods are flawed, his conclusions are too extreme, and his evidence is cherry-picked.
But his work has definitely sparked debate.
And it makes you think, doesn't it?
It challenges us to question everything, even the things we think we know for sure.
And that's never a bad thing, right?
Absolutely. It keeps us on our toes.
So there you have it. A deep dive into the world of Anatoly Fomenko and his new chronology.
It's a wild ride, for sure.
It is a real intellectual roller coaster. And it leaves us with more questions than answers, I think.
But that's the point, isn't it? It's about the journey, the exploration.
And remember, this deep dive has only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore in Fomenko's books and in the works of those who have debated his theories.
So keep reading, keep researching, and keep those critical thinking skills sharp.
And remember, history is not just about memorizing dates and names.
It's about understanding the story of humanity.
And who knows, maybe Fomenko is right, and that story is completely different than we ever imagined.
It's a tantalizing thought, isn't it?
It is. So until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep digging deeper.
See you next time.
Bye.